The thermometer outside Victor Novak's stone-wrapped shelter read negative 18 degrees Fahrenheit on that January morning in 1951. Inside, without touching the fire he'd banked 8 hours earlier, the temperature held at 29 degrees, and his coffee water had never frozen. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. The cabin was supposed to keep them alive. Victor Novak had built it in September of 1949, following the same pattern every homesteader in the Montana high country used. Logs notched at the corners, mud chinked between the gaps, a single door facing east, one small window on the south wall, and a stone fireplace that drew smoke reasonably well. It had taken him and 3 neighbors 6 days to complete. By frontier standards, it was adequate shelter. By December, Victor understood that adequate wasn't enough. The first serious cold came on December 8th. The temperature dropped to 5 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. Victor woke at 3 in the morning to feed the fire, as he'd done every few hours since sunset. The interior of the cabin felt brutally cold despite the flames. He could see his breath in the firelight. The water bucket near the door had frozen solid. Ilona was wrapped in every blanket they owned, shivering beside the fire. Victor fed more wood into the flames and returned to bed. Sleep came in fragments between the cold and the constant need to maintain the fire. By morning, the temperature outside had dropped further. Inside, despite burning wood continuously through the night, the cabin never warmed above 30 degrees. This became their routine. Every night from December through February, Victor rose multiple times to feed the fire. Every morning they woke exhausted and cold. The wood consumption was staggering. Victor had cut and stacked what he thought was more than enough firewood for winter. By January, he realized he'd underestimated by half. Ilona developed frostbite on 3 toes in early February. The injury came from a simple trip to the outdoor privy. 30 seconds in negative 10-degree weather, inadequate footwear, and the damage was done. Victor watched his wife suffer and felt the weight of his failure. He'd brought her from Budapest to Montana with promises of land and opportunity. Instead, he'd delivered hardship that threatened her health. The neighbors endured similar conditions. Everyone accepted this as the price of homesteading in the high country. You burned massive amounts of wood, you slept in layers, you suffered through the nights, and you survived until spring. Men had done it for generations. Victor had done it for one winter. He decided one winter was enough. When the snow finally melted in late March, Victor began studying stone. Not building with stone, just studying how it behaved. He placed rocks near the fire and observed how they absorbed heat. He left stones outside overnight and noted how they retained cold. He remembered things his grandfather had told him in Hungary about root cellars that stayed cool in summer without ice. Other homesteaders noticed Victor's strange new interest. They didn't understand why a man would spend time examining rocks when there were fields to clear and crops to plant. Victor didn't explain. He simply continued his observations, forming ideas that would change everything. Victor's grandfather had been a stonemason in the village of Sopron, near the Austrian border. As a boy, Victor had spent summers watching the old man work, learning skills he never thought he'd need in America. His grandfather built root cellars that kept vegetables fresh through brutal Hungarian winters and cool through sweltering summers. The secret, his grandfather always said, was understanding that stone remembered temperature. That phrase had meant nothing to Victor as a child. Now, sitting beside his inadequate cabin in April of 1950, it meant everything. Stone remembered temperature. It absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly. It didn't conduct cold the way metal did. It didn't burn like wood or rot like organic materials. It simply held whatever temperature it acquired and gave it back gradually over time. His grandfather's root cellars worked because the stone walls absorbed the cool earth temperature in summer and the residual warmth in winter, maintaining a stable environment regardless of exterior conditions. Victor began experimenting with thermal mass in ways his neighbors found peculiar. He built a small stone enclosure around his outdoor fire pit, stacking rocks in a circle 3 feet high. He noticed the stones stayed warm long after the fire died, radiating heat for hours. He built a stone shelf inside his cabin near the fireplace and observed how it held warmth through the night when the fire burned low. His neighbor Janos Kovac stopped by one afternoon and found Victor sitting beside a pile of stones, occasionally touching them and making notes in a small journal. Janos asked what he was doing. Victor tried to explain thermal mass and heat retention. Janos looked at him like he'd gone mad from the winter cold, but Victor continued. He read everything he could find about building techniques. The homestead had no library, but the trading post in Helena carried a few books on construction. Victor borrowed a manual on masonry work and another on root cellar construction. He studied the principles of insulation, learning that dead air spaces were among the best insulators available. He learned about heat stratification and how warm air rose while cold air settled. By May, Victor had developed a theory. If stone could hold temperature and if air gaps prevented heat transfer, then a structure that combined both principles might retain warmth far better than conventional log construction. The challenge was applying this theory to a building that could withstand Montana weather while remaining practical to construct. Most homesteaders built with logs because timber was abundant and the technique was proven. But Victor had watched his cabin fail despite following proven methods. Proven didn't mean optimal, it just meant traditional. Victor needed something better than traditional. He spent June considering different approaches. Stone construction alone would take years for one man working alone. Log construction he'd already tried and found wanting. He needed something that combined the thermal mass of stone with a faster construction method. The answer came in late June, when Stefan Baran mentioned seeing surplus military equipment for sale in Great Falls, military surplus. Victor had seen photographs of Quonset huts during the war, curved metal structures that went up quickly. He'd never considered them as permanent shelter. Nobody had. Metal was cold. Everyone knew metal was cold, but metal over stone, with air between them, might be something entirely different. Victor rode to Great Falls in early July, a journey that took 2 days by horse. The military surplus yard operated by Milos Petrov occupied 5 acres on the edge of town. Rows of equipment stretched in every direction: jeeps, tents, crates of uniforms, stacks of lumber, and dozens of curved metal structures rusting in the summer sun. Victor approached a Quonset hut and examined it carefully. The structure was approximately 20 feet wide and 36 feet long, made of corrugated steel panels that formed a distinctive semicircular cross-section. The design was brilliantly simple: arch-shaped metal framework covered with steel sheeting. No interior supports needed. The curved shape shed snow and rain naturally. Assembly required no specialized skills, just bolts and basic tools. Milos found Victor studying the structures and launched into his standard pitch. The huts were cheap because nobody wanted them. Soldiers had used them during the war as temporary barracks and storage. They were designed for quick assembly and disassembly, not permanent habitation. They were impossible to heat in winter and became ovens in summer. Most buyers used them for equipment storage or animal shelters. Victor asked about pricing. Milos quoted $35 for a complete hut, including all panels, framework, hardware, and assembly instructions. Transport to the homestead would cost another $15, $50 total for a complete metal structure. Victor had $63 saved from selling his first year's modest wheat crop. $50 was nearly everything he had. Ilona had been hoping they could buy a better stove or perhaps a milk cow. Victor stood in the surplus yard doing calculations in his head. The metal structure alone wouldn't work, everyone knew that. But the metal structure sitting inside stone walls with airspace between them that might work brilliantly. Milos noticed Victor's intense focus and softened his pitch. He explained that most farmers bought the huts for storage because they were weatherproof and went up in days instead of weeks. Nobody lived in them by choice. The metal conducted temperature too efficiently. Winter cold came straight through the walls. Summer heat turned them into sweat boxes. They were fundamentally unsuitable as human shelter. Victor asked if Milos had ever seen anyone build stone walls around a Quonset hut. Milos laughed and said that would be the most expensive storage shed in Montana. Why spend weeks stacking stone around a $35 metal building? If you wanted stone construction, just build a stone structure. If you wanted quick assembly, just use the metal. Combining them made no sense. Victor didn't argue. He'd learned that explaining his ideas before completing them only generated mockery. He asked about delivery timing. Milos said he could have a hut transported within a week. Victor counted out $50 in bills and coins. Milos wrote up a receipt and asked where to deliver it. Victor provided directions to his homestead and asked one more question. Had Milos sold many Quonsets to homesteaders? Milos said he'd sold perhaps 20 in the past year, all for storage or animal shelter. Victor was the first person buying one who seemed to be considering it as human habitation. Milos warned him again, the metal would be unbearably cold come winter. Victor thanked him and began the 2-day ride home. He had just spent nearly all his money on something his neighbors would consider insane. He had no guarantee his theory would work. But he remembered his grandfather's words about stone remembering temperature, and he remembered the brutal winter that had frozen his wife's toes, and he decided that insane was better than another winter like the last one. The Quonset hut arrived on a Saturday in mid-July, hauled on a flatbed wagon pulled by 4 horses. The delivery created immediate attention. Homesteads were spread far apart in the high country, but news traveled through the small community with remarkable speed. By afternoon, 3 neighbors had found excuses to visit Victor's property. Janos Kovac arrived first, looking at the stack of curved metal panels with unconcealed amusement. He asked Victor if he'd lost his mind. Victor explained he was building a new shelter using the metal structure as part of the design. Janos asked why anyone would spend $50 on a metal shed when that money could buy livestock or tools or a dozen things more useful than an Army surplus icebox. Victor tried to explain his concept: stone walls for thermal mass, metal roof for weather protection, airspace for insulation. Janos listened with increasing skepticism. He'd lived in Montana for 12 years. He knew what worked and what didn't. Stone construction took forever. Metal was cold. Combining them didn't make either one better. It just wasted time and money on a complicated version of failure. Stefan Baran arrived while Janos was still criticizing. Stefan took a different approach. He'd known Victor for a year and respected his work ethic. He asked genuine questions about the design. Victor sketched his plan in the dirt: oval stone foundation, walls rising 4 feet high, metal structure sitting inside with air gap all around. Stefan studied the sketch and admitted it was interesting in theory, but theory didn't keep you warm in January. Anton Dvorak, the closest thing the community had to a professional carpenter, stopped by that evening. He examined the Quonset panels with professional interest. The engineering was sound for what it was designed to do: quick temporary shelter. But permanent habitation required different considerations. Wood insulated, metal conducted. No amount of creative arrangement would change basic material properties. Victor listened to all 3 men without arguing. He appreciated their concern even when it came wrapped in mockery. These were good men trying to prevent a neighbor from making an expensive mistake. But none of them had watched their wives develop frostbite. None of them had spent a winter burning twice the expected firewood and still shivering through every night. Victor had, and that experience trumped all theoretical objections. After the neighbors left, Ilona asked Victor if he was certain about the plan. $50 was everything they'd saved. If the design failed, they'd face another winter in the old cabin with no money for improvements. Victor admitted he wasn't certain. Certainty required proof, and proof required building. But he was confident enough to risk everything on the attempt. Ilona touched his hand and said she trusted him. She'd married a stonemason's grandson who'd brought her across an ocean to build a new life. If he said stone and metal could combine into warmth, she believed him. But she also said he'd better be right, because she wasn't spending another winter losing toes to frostbite. Victor smiled and promised her warm feet come January. Then he walked out to examine the pile of metal panels sitting beside his inadequate cabin. The mockery had begun. The real work started tomorrow. He had 4 months to prove everyone wrong. Victor began work the next morning, but not with the metal panels everyone expected. Instead, he started gathering stones. He walked the creek beds and hillsides within 2 miles of his property, selecting rocks with specific characteristics, flat surfaces for stacking, roughly uniform sizes, dense stone that wouldn't crack from temperature changes. He rejected soft sandstone and chose granite and basalt. The neighbors noticed immediately. Janos stopped by after 3 days and found Victor with piles of sorted stones arranged by size and shape. He asked when Victor planned to assemble the metal building. Victor said the metal would go up in a few days. First, he needed proper foundation. Janos looked at the stone piles and the markers Victor had placed in an oval pattern 40 feet long by 24 feet wide. The markers outlined a foundation much larger than the Quonset footprint. Victor explained he was building stone walls that would extend beyond the metal structure. Janos asked why. Victor said thermal mass and insulation. Janos shook his head and left. At the trading post that evening, he told everyone Victor was building a stone fence before assembling his metal shed. The story generated predictable laughter. Victor spent 3 weeks on the foundation. He dug a shallow trench following his oval markers, 8 inches deep and 20 inches wide. He filled the trench with large stones set firmly in place, creating a level base. The work was backbreaking. Each stone required careful placement. Victor checked level constantly using a water-filled trough his grandfather had taught him to make. The foundation had to be precise, or everything built upon it would fail. Stefan visited during the second week and watched Victor work for an hour without speaking. Finally, he asked why Victor was investing such effort in foundation work. Most cabins sat directly on the ground or on a few flat stones at the corners. Victor explained that stone walls needed stable foundations to prevent settling. If the foundation shifted, gaps would open in the walls. Gaps meant heat loss. Everything depended on the foundation being right. Anton stopped by near the end of week 3. He admitted the foundation work was impressive, even if the overall plan remained questionable. The stone base was level within a 1/4 inch across the entire oval. That kind of precision belonged in professional construction, not homestead building. Anton asked where Victor learned such meticulous technique. Victor said his grandfather would accept nothing less. Sloppy foundation meant sloppy building meant failure. By the end of July, Victor had a complete stone foundation encircling an oval larger than his Quonset hut. The neighbors thought he'd wasted 3 weeks building an elaborate base for a storage shed. Victor thought he'd invested 3 weeks in the most critical component of his survival shelter. Everything else would be built upon this foundation. It had to be perfect. It was. Victor began raising stone walls on August 1st. The technique was dry stack masonry his grandfather had taught him as a bow. No mortar. Each stone carefully selected and placed so its weight and shape locked it into position. The method required more skill than mortared construction because every stone had to fit precisely. He started at the foundation and worked upward, selecting stones that fit together like puzzle pieces, larger stones at the bottom courses, slightly smaller stones as the wall rose, each stone placed with attention to how its weight distributed across the stones beneath. Victor checked level constantly and adjusted placement until every stone sat exactly right. The work progressed, slowly. Some days he placed 50 stones. Other days, searching for the right stone for a particular position, consumed hours and resulted in placing just a dozen. His neighbors watched with increasing bewilderment. Stefan asked why Victor was building what appeared to be a circular stone fence 4 feet high. Victor said it wasn't a fence, it was a wall. Stefan asked what the difference was. Victor said a fence kept things out. A wall kept warmth in. Janos visited in mid-August and found Victor shaping a stone with a hammer and chisel. The walls had reached 3 feet high and formed a complete oval. Janos admitted the stonework was beautiful, then asked the obvious question: why build such elaborate walls around a metal shed? Victor invited him to touch the stones. The afternoon sun had been beating on them for hours. The stones were warm to the touch. Victor explained that in winter these stones would absorb heat from inside and radiate it back through the night. Janos remained unconvinced. He'd never heard of anyone heating a building with stones. You heated buildings with fire. The fire warmed the air. When the fire died, the warmth disappeared. That's how heating worked. Victor said that's how heating worked in wooden structures. Stone worked differently. Janos left, shaking his head. Anton visited weekly, partly from genuine interest and partly from professional curiosity. The stone walls were exceeding anything he'd seen in frontier construction. Victor's technique was old-world craftsmanship applied to new-world problems. Anton asked how high the walls would go. Victor said 4 feet, high enough to contain the lower portion of the Quonset while leaving the curved upper section exposed. Anton sketched the design and admitted it was at least interesting, even if doomed to freeze come winter. By the end of August, Victor had completed stone walls encircling his foundation, 4 feet high, 2 feet thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the top. The walls formed a solid barrier with one opening on the southeast side for the entrance. The stonework had consumed the entire month. Victor's hands were calloused and scarred from handling thousands of rocks. His neighbors called it Novak's folly. Victor called it progress. Victor assembled the Quonset hut in 3 days, starting September 2nd. The military instructions were clear and the design brilliantly simple. Arc-shaped steel ribs bolted together at the crown. Corrugated steel panels attached to the ribs with self-tapping screws. No complex joinery, no precision cuts. Just systematic assembly following the provided pattern. Stefan and Anton helped with the raising. The curved ribs were light enough for 2 men to lift but awkward to position. Victor had placed wooden stakes inside the stone oval to mark where each rib would stand. The stakes ensured the metal structure would sit precisely centered within the stone walls, maintaining equal air gap on all sides. The first rib went up at sunrise. By noon, all 8 ribs were positioned and bolted together at the crown. The skeleton of the structure stood complete, a graceful curve rising from within the stone enclosure. Stefan admitted it looked striking, metal arching upward from ancient stone. Whether it would work remained uncertain, but it certainly looked intentional. The steel panels went on faster. Each panel overlapped the previous one and screwed directly into the ribs. Victor worked methodically, ensuring each panel was tight and properly sealed. He used rubber gaskets at every seam, something the military instructions noted as optional. Victor made them mandatory. Any gap would leak heat in winter. By the end of day 2, the entire structure was enclosed except for the entrance area. The curved metal shell sat within the stone walls exactly as Victor had envisioned. The air gap between stone and metal measured 6 inches at the base, gradually increasing to 12 inches at the 4-foot height, where stone ended and metal continued upward. Janos arrived that evening with 3 other neighbors. They stood outside the structure, examining what Victor had built. The comments ranged from bemused to openly mocking. One man called it a stone skirt on a metal barrel. Another said Victor had built the most expensive potato shed in Montana. Janos made a public declaration. He'd bet $10 that Victor would freeze worse than anyone come January because metal pulled cold straight through stone. Victor didn't accept the bet. He simply continued working. On day 3, he installed the end panels, cut openings for the entrance and window, and bolted on the steel door frames provided with the kit. By sunset on September 4th, the structure was complete. Metal shelter sitting within stone walls, exactly as planned. The neighbors left, still laughing. Stefan stayed behind. He walked around the structure twice, studying the construction from every angle. Finally, he asked Victor a serious question. "Do you really believe this will work?" Victor touched the stone walls, already cooling as the sun set. He said he believed stone would hold heat, that metal alone would lose. Whether that belief was correct, they'd know by January. Stefan nodded and walked home. Victor stood beside his creation, metal gleaming in the fading light, stone solid beneath. 4 months of work, nearly all his money. Everything depended on physics he understood from observation, but couldn't prove until winter tested his theory. The 6-inch gap between stone walls and metal structure became Victor's most defended design feature. Neighbors questioned it constantly. The space seemed wasteful. If Victor wanted stone walls, why not build them tight against the metal? If he wanted the metal protected, why leave gaps where wind could blow through? Victor explained the principle repeatedly, though few believed him. Air that couldn't move was one of nature's best insulators. The gap between stone and metal created a dead air space that would prevent heat transfer. The stone would absorb warmth from the interior. The air gap would prevent that warmth from transferring to the cold metal. The metal would shed rain and snow. Each component performed a specific function. Janos challenged the logic. He argued that air gaps meant drafts. Drafts meant cold. Victor should have built the stone tight against the metal to prevent any air movement. Victor tried explaining that dead air and moving air were completely different. Dead air trapped in a space couldn't convey heat. Moving air carried warmth away. The key was ensuring the air stayed trapped. To prove his point, Victor demonstrated with a simple test. He built a small fire inside his old cabin and invited neighbors to observe. He placed 3 rocks at different distances from the fire, one touching the hearth, one 6 inches away, one 12 inches away. After an hour, he had everyone touch the stones. The stone touching the hearth was too hot to hold. The stone 6 inches away was warm but comfortable. The stone 12 inches away was barely warm. Victor explained that air between the fire and the distant stone prevented heat transfer. The same principle applied to his building. Interior heat would warm the stone walls. The air gap would prevent that heat from jumping to the cold metal. The metal's exterior temperature wouldn't matter because it wasn't connected to the interior except through dead air. Stefan understood first. He'd worked with insulation before and recognized Victor was describing a principle he'd seen in root cellars and ice houses. Anton remained skeptical, but admitted the demonstration was interesting. Janos dismissed it entirely. Testing stones near a fire didn't prove anything about heating a building through Montana winter. Victor also maintained the air gap at the roofline. Where the curved metal continued above the stone walls, he installed wooden spacers every 3 feet. The spacers held the metal away from the stone top edge, ensuring continuous airspace around the entire lower perimeter. This detail required careful work. Each spacer had to be precisely cut and positioned. By mid-September, Victor had completed the air gap system. The space between stone and metal remained consistent around the entire structure. Wooden spacers prevented any contact between materials. The design looked strange to frontier eyes accustomed to tight construction, but Victor was building for physics, not appearance. His neighbors called it overthinking. Victor called it essential. The air gap would prove which assessment was correct. Winter would judge whether Victor's obsession with 6 inches of empty space was genius or madness. He suspected genius. His neighbors suspected madness. By January, everyone would know. Victor spent 2 weeks building the entrance, far longer than any neighbor thought reasonable. The opening he'd left in the stone wall measured 4 feet wide. The opening he'd cut in the metal structure aligned precisely behind it. Between these 2 openings, Victor created an entrance system unlike anything in frontier construction. He started by extending the stone walls inward at the opening, creating a short passage 3 feet deep. This passage formed an airlock between exterior and interior. Someone entering would pass through the outer opening, stand in the stone passage, then pass through the inner opening. The design prevented direct wind flow from outside to inside. For the outer door, Victor used heavy pine planks he'd traded for at the mill in Helena. He selected boards with tight grain and no knots. Each plank measured 2 inches thick and 16 inches wide. He fitted 6 planks together using tongue and groove joinery, creating a door that was effectively a single solid piece of wood. The door measured 3 feet wide and 6 feet tall. He reinforced the outer door with iron strapping purchased from the same surplus yard where he'd bought the Quonset. The strapping formed an X pattern across the door's interior face, bolted through the wood with carriage bolts. The reinforcement added weight, but made the door rigid and incredibly strong. He hung it on heavy strap hinges, mortised into both the door and the stone jamb. The inner door, where the entrance passage met the metal structure, used a standard steel door that came with the Quonset kit. Victor modified it by adding a wooden interior panel for insulation. The 2-door system meant someone entering would open the outer door, step into the stone passage, close the outer door, then open the inner door. Cold air would be trapped in the passage rather than flowing directly into the living space. Janos visited during construction and called the double-door system ridiculous. 1 door kept the weather out. 2 doors just meant twice the maintenance and twice the gaps where cold could enter. Victor demonstrated how the airlock worked. With both doors closed, the passage between them held still air. That air buffered the interior from exterior temperature. Janos remained unconvinced. Victor added a final detail that Anton appreciated, even if others didn't. He built a small shelf in the stone passage for setting down items when coming or going. The shelf was simple, just a flat stone projecting from the wall, but it showed Victor was thinking about daily living, not just theoretical thermal principles. The entrance consumed 14 days of work. Most frontier doors took half a day to hang, but Victor's entrance wasn't a door. It was a thermal barrier system designed to minimize heat loss every time someone entered or exited. The stone passage, double doors, and careful sealing represented the same obsessive attention to detail he'd applied to every aspect of the structure. By the end of September, the entrance was complete. Neighbors joked that Victor had spent 2 weeks building a hallway to nowhere. Victor said he'd built an airlock that would keep warmth inside where it belonged. Both descriptions were accurate. Which one mattered more would be clear by December. Victor had saved the most critical component for last, the heating system. Everything else in his design focused on retaining warmth, but first he needed to generate warmth efficiently. He'd watched his old cabin waste heat through poor fireplace design. His new structure would waste nothing. He started by building a firebox inside the structure, positioned against the interior surface of the stone wall. The location was deliberate. The stone wall would absorb heat radiating from the fire and store it for hours after the flames died. He used fire brick for the firebox interior, materials he'd hauled from Helena at considerable expense. Fire brick could withstand extreme temperatures without cracking. The firebox measured 3 feet wide, 2 feet deep, and 3 feet tall. Large enough to burn substantial logs, but small enough to heat efficiently. Victor designed it with a narrow throat that funneled smoke upward while reflecting heat outward. The principle came from Rumford fireplace designs he'd read about, refined for his specific application. The chimney presented a unique challenge. It had to pass through the curved metal roof without creating leaks or compromising the structure's integrity. Victor fabricated a metal collar that fit around the chimney pipe and bolted to the Quonset ribs. The collar included a flashing skirt that shed water away from the penetration. He sealed every joint with high-temperature caulk. The chimney itself was constructed from sections of steel stovepipe, each section fitted tightly to the next. Victor ran the pipe straight up from the firebox, through the metal roof, extending 4 feet above the highest point of the curved structure. The height ensured proper draft and prevented downdrafts during wind. Inside, where the chimney met the ceiling, Victor built a heat reclaimer using the same principle he'd seen in efficient stoves. He added horizontal baffles that forced hot gases to travel a longer path before exiting. The baffles extracted additional heat from the smoke, transferring it to the interior space rather than sending it straight up the chimney. Anton visited during the chimney work and admitted this part of Victor's design was genuinely clever. The heat reclaimer would capture warmth that conventional fireplaces wasted. The stone firebox backing would store thermal energy. The combination represented sophisticated understanding of heat transfer. Anton asked where Victor learned such techniques. Victor said necessity was an excellent teacher. By early October, the heating system was complete. Victor tested it on a cool evening, building a small fire to verify the draft and check for smoke leaks. The system performed perfectly. Smoke drew cleanly up the chimney. Heat radiated from the firebox into the space. The stone wall behind the fire grew warm to the touch within an hour. The test convinced Victor his theories were sound. Stone absorbed heat. The air gap prevented heat loss to the metal. The curved metal roof reflected heat downward rather than absorbing it. Every component worked as designed. Now he needed winter to prove it all mattered. October's gentle cold wouldn't test his structure. He needed January's brutal temperatures. He needed the kind of cold that had frozen his wife's toes and convinced him adequate shelter wasn't enough. The first hard freeze came on October 19th. Victor woke to frost covering everything outside. The thermometer he'd mounted on the exterior stone wall read 22 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside his old cabin, where Ilona still slept while Victor finished details on the new structure, the temperature hovered around 30 degrees despite the fire she'd maintained through the night. Victor had moved into the new shelter 3 days earlier, sleeping on a simple cot, while he completed interior work. He'd built a moderate fire the previous evening, nothing excessive, just enough to take the chill off. He'd banked the coals around 10 o'clock and gone to sleep under 2 wool blankets. He woke at sunrise feeling surprisingly comfortable. The interior air didn't have the biting cold he'd expected. He touched the stone walls near the firebox. They were warm, noticeably warmer than the interior air. The stones had absorbed heat from the evening fire and were radiating it back into the space. Victor checked the thermometer he'd mounted on the interior wall, away from the direct influence of the fireplace. 48 degrees. Outside was 22. Inside was 48. A 26-degree difference with just a moderate evening fire that had been banked for 8 hours. He rebuilt the fire and made coffee. While the water heated, he walked around the interior, touching different surfaces and noting temperatures. The stone walls all around the perimeter held residual warmth. The metal roof was cool, but not freezing. The air near the floor was cooler than the air at chest height. Normal stratification, but even the floor-level air felt tolerable. Ilona arrived mid-morning to see how the first night had gone. Victor showed her the thermometer readings he'd recorded: 22 degrees outside at dawn, 48 degrees inside with a banked fire. She touched the stone walls and felt the stored warmth. She asked if this would hold in deeper cold. Victor admitted he didn't know. October cold wasn't January cold. 22 degrees was uncomfortable but not brutal. The real test would come when temperatures dropped below zero and stayed there for weeks. But the first results were encouraging. The stone was behaving exactly as he'd predicted, absorbing and storing heat through the night. He showed Ilona other details he'd noticed. The entrance airlock worked as designed. Opening the inner door didn't create a blast of cold air because the stone passage buffered the temperature difference. The gap between stone and metal showed no signs of frost or condensation. The chimney drew perfectly without backdrafts. Stefan stopped by that afternoon. Victor shared the temperature readings. Stefan admitted he was surprised. A 26-degree difference seemed significant, though he cautioned against assuming October performance would match January performance. Victor agreed, but he also noted that in his old cabin, the temperature difference on similar nights was usually 10 to 12 degrees at most, even with fires burning all night. The first test wasn't conclusive, but it was promising. Victor moved his belongings from the old cabin that week. Whatever winter brought, he'd face it in his stone-wrapped shelter. The engineering was complete. Now physics would have its say. November brought the first sustained cold. Temperatures dropped into the single digits and stayed there for 5 consecutive nights. The high country entered early winter, and homesteaders settled into the familiar pattern of constant fire tending and layered clothing. Victor and Ilona faced their first real test. Victor maintained a morning and evening fire routine. He built up the fire at sunrise, let it burn hot for 2 hours, then allowed it to die down to coals. He repeated the process at sunset. The twice-daily pattern consumed far less wood than the constant burning required in the old cabin, yet the interior temperature remained consistently comfortable. On the coldest November night, when exterior temperatures reached 6 degrees, the interior held at 39 degrees by morning, 43 degrees after Victor rebuilt the morning fire. The stone walls absorbed heat during the burning periods and released it gradually between fires. The thermal mass was performing exactly as Victor had calculated. Ilona noticed practical differences beyond temperature numbers. In the old cabin, she'd slept under 4 wool blankets and still woke cold. In the new shelter, 2 blankets sufficed. Water buckets no longer froze overnight. Bread dough left rising in the evening was still workable by morning. The consistent temperature made daily tasks easier. Stefan Baran visited in mid-November and spent an hour inside the shelter. The exterior temperature was 14 degrees. Inside felt comfortable enough that Stefan removed his heavy coat after 10 minutes. He examined Victor's temperature logs, noting the consistent 35 to 45 degree range regardless of exterior conditions. Stefan asked detailed questions about the wood consumption. Victor showed him the wood pile. In the old cabin, November typically consumed 2 cords of wood. Victor had burned perhaps 3/4 of a cord so far. The efficiency gain was substantial. Stefan touched the stone walls, feeling the stored warmth. He admitted Victor might have solved something significant. That evening, Stefan brought his family to see the shelter. His wife stood inside, feeling the comfortable air, comparing it to their cabin, where cold seeped through gaps and fires barely kept the interior above freezing. Stefan's children touched the warm stone walls with wonder. Stefan asked Victor if he'd be willing to explain the construction process in detail. Victor agreed readily. He'd never intended to keep his methods secret. If the design worked, others should benefit. Stefan took notes while Victor explained the foundation, stone wall construction, air gap maintenance, and thermal mass principles. Stefan asked about costs. Victor calculated approximately $75 total, including the Quonset, stonework labor excluded. Other neighbors began stopping by. Some remained skeptical, arguing that November cold wasn't real cold. Wait for January, they said. Wait for sustained below-zero temperatures. Wait for the kind of cold that killed unprepared homesteaders. Then judge whether stone walls around metal made any difference. Victor didn't argue. He simply maintained his twice-daily fires and recorded his temperature readings. The stone walls grew warmer with each heating cycle accumulating thermal energy like a battery charging. By late November, the walls held residual warmth, even 16 hours after the last fire. Janos visited on the last day of November. He stood inside without speaking for several minutes, then asked what the interior temperature was. Victor showed him 42 degrees with no active fire for 6 hours. Exterior temperature was 11 degrees. Janos asked how much wood Victor had burned that day. Victor said 2 armloads morning and evening. Janos admitted that was less than half what his cabin required. December arrived with temperatures that made November seem mild. The first week brought sustained cold in the negative single digits. By mid-December, the thermometer outside Victor's shelter read negative 12 degrees 3 mornings in succession. This was the cold that killed. This was the cold that tested everything. Conventional cabins throughout the high country became desperate places. Families burned wood constantly, yet interior temperatures rarely exceeded 25 degrees. Children slept in layers beside fires that parents fed every 2 hours through the night. Frostbite became common. Simple tasks like fetching water or using the privy became dangerous expeditions into potentially lethal cold. Janos Kovac's family suffered particularly hard. His cabin, built using standard methods, leaked heat through dozens of small gaps. The chinking between logs had dried and cracked. Cold air poured through spaces around the door and window. Despite burning 3 cords of wood per week, the interior never felt warm. His children developed chilblains on their fingers and toes. Victor's shelter performed beyond his expectations. With morning and evening fires, the interior maintained 35 to 40 degrees consistently. The stone walls, now thoroughly heat-saturated from 6 weeks of regular firing, held and released warmth with impressive efficiency. The mass of stone acted exactly as Victor had predicted, storing thermal energy during burning periods and radiating it back during cold periods. The air gap prevented the brutal exterior cold from transferring to the interior stone. Victor occasionally touched the metal exterior panels. They were freezing, as cold as the surrounding air, but that cold couldn't jump the 6-inch dead airspace to reach the stone. The stone stayed warm from interior heat. The metal stayed cold from exterior temperatures. The two systems remained thermally isolated. Ilona moved through their shelter wearing a single sweater during daytime hours. In the old cabin, she'd worn 3 layers and still shivered. The consistent temperature allowed normal activities. She could bake bread, mend clothing, or work on household tasks without her fingers going numb. Victor continued his outside work in short sessions, but he could return to genuine warmth rather than merely less intense cold. Stefan visited during the second week of December. His family was struggling in their conventional cabin. He asked if Victor could help him build a similar shelter. Victor agreed immediately. He explained that starting construction in December was impossible. Frozen ground prevented foundation work, but come spring, Stefan would be first priority. Anton arrived on December 18th with a request that carried weight. His elderly mother lived with his family. The cold was becoming dangerous for her. Could Victor share his shelter until spring? Victor and Ilona discussed it briefly and agreed. Anton's mother moved in the next day. Occupying a corner space, Victor partitioned with blankets. The old woman's presence provided unexpected validation. She'd lived through 50 Montana winters. She'd survived in sod houses, log cabins, and frame structures. After 3 days in Victor's shelter, she declared it the warmest winter housing she'd ever experienced. Her chilblains began healing. Her breathing improved. She stopped the constant shivering that had worried Anton. Word spread through the community with new urgency. Victor Novak's ridiculous stone-wrapped metal shed was proving itself in conditions that tested every structure. January 8, 1951, brought the coldest morning of Victor's life in Montana. He woke before dawn and checked the exterior thermometer by lamplight. Negative 18 degrees Fahrenheit, the kind of cold that froze exposed skin in minutes. the kind of cold that killed livestock and split trees with explosive cracks. Victor had banked the fire the previous evening around 9 o'clock, 8 hours earlier. He'd loaded the firebox with slow-burning oak, adjusted the damper for minimal airflow, and covered the coals with ash to extend the burn time, standard procedure for overnight heating. He checked the interior thermometer, 29 degrees. He checked it again to confirm, 29 degrees. The exterior was -18. The interior was 29, 47 degrees warmer inside than outside, with a fire that had been banked for 8 hours. Victor touched the stone walls. They were warm, noticeably warm. The thermal mass had absorbed heat throughout the previous day and was radiating it back steadily through the night. He examined the firebox. Live coals still glowed beneath the ash layer. Not enough to provide direct heat, but enough to prove the fire had maintained itself through the night. He moved to the coffee pot. Water inside showed no ice crystals. In the old cabin, water froze solid on nights like this. Here it remained liquid. Victor poured the water into his kettle and rebuilt the fire. Within 20 minutes, the interior temperature began climbing toward 40 degrees. Ilona woke and immediately noticed the comfortable air. She checked the thermometers herself, disbelieving the 47-degree difference. Victor showed her his logbook where he'd recorded temperatures throughout the winter. The pattern was clear. As exterior temperatures dropped, the insulating properties of his design became more pronounced. The colder it got outside, the more his shelter outperformed conventional construction. Anton's mother shuffled from her corner and stood near the firebox, warming her hands. She told them that in all her years, she'd never experienced such comfort during deep cold. Most winters were battles against the weather. This winter, in this shelter, felt almost comfortable. Stefan arrived mid-morning. Victor showed him the temperature readings. Stefan asked to examine everything, the stone walls, the air gap, the firebox, the chimney. He took notes on every detail. He asked Victor to estimate wood consumption. Victor said he'd burned approximately 1 cord of wood in December. Stefan said he'd burned 5 cords in the same period. The mathematics were undeniable. Victor's shelter stayed 47 degrees warmer on the coldest night while consuming 1/5 the firewood. The efficiency wasn't marginal improvement. It was revolutionary difference. Stefan asked when they could start building his shelter. Victor said the moment ground thawed enough to dig foundation trenches, they'd begin. Janos arrived that afternoon. He didn't mock. He didn't argue. He simply asked if Victor would help him build a similar structure. His children were suffering. His wife was exhausted from maintaining fires around the clock. Pride no longer mattered. Warmth mattered. Victor said yes. He'd help anyone who asked. Spring would be busy with construction. But everyone who wanted this shelter would get help building it. The knowledge wasn't his to hoard. It belonged to anyone who needed to survive Montana winters without suffering. Janos returned on January 12th with his entire family. His wife carried their youngest child, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The child was lethargic, showing signs of dangerous cold exposure. Janos asked if his family could stay in Victor's shelter until the cold broke. His cabin had become uninhabitable. Victor and Ilona agreed immediately. Space was limited, but lives mattered more than comfort. Janos's family moved into the remaining corner. 9 people now occupied a shelter designed for 2. The crowding was challenging, but the warmth was adequate. Victor maintained his twice-daily fires, and the stone walls continued radiating stored heat. That evening, after the children slept, Janos apologized. He'd mocked Victor's design publicly and repeatedly. He'd called it foolish, wasteful, and doomed to fail. He'd been wrong about everything. Victor waved off the apology. Being wrong wasn't a sin. Refusing to adapt when proven wrong would be. Janos wanted to understand the principles. Victor explained thermal mass using examples Janos could grasp. Stone was like a reservoir that stored heat instead of water. The air gap was like wool clothing that trapped warmth. The metal roof was like a waterproof shell that shed weather while the insulation beneath did the real work. Janos asked about construction details. How deep was the foundation? How thick were the walls? What maintained the air gap? Victor answered every question, sketching details in the packed earth floor with a stick. He estimated Janos could build a similar shelter in 3 months working alone, or 6 weeks with help. The cost worried Janos. $50 for the Quonset was manageable, but he'd need tools and hardware. Victor said they could share tools. Hardware could be salvaged or improvised. Stone was free for the gathering. The main investment was time and labor. Janos had both. Other families began arriving over the following week, not to stay, but to see. Word of the 47-degree difference had spread through the isolated homesteading community. People needed to witness it themselves. Victor welcomed everyone, showed them the construction details, and offered to help with their builds come spring. Anton brought paper and pencils. He sketched Victor's shelter from multiple angles, noting dimensions and construction details. He created plans that others could follow. Victor reviewed the drawings and suggested corrections. Anton revised them until they accurately represented every critical detail. By late January, Victor's shelter had become an informal community center. Families stopped by to warm themselves during supply trips. Neighbors gathered to discuss spring construction plans. Children played in genuine warmth for the first time in months. The ridicule had transformed into respect. Stefan asked if Victor regretted not charging for his knowledge. 50 families would likely build similar shelters. Victor said he hadn't built this shelter for profit. He'd built it to survive. If others survived because of what he'd learned, that was reward enough. Ilona added that they'd received payment in other forms. Neighbors brought food and offered assistance with spring planting. The community was taking care of them because they'd shared rather than hoarded. The brutal cold continued through January, but Victor's shelter never wavered. The stone walls continued storing and releasing heat. The design proved itself night after night through the worst weather Montana winter could deliver. The cold finally broke in early March. Temperatures climbed above freezing during daylight hours. Snow began melting. Ground gradually thawed. Homesteaders emerged from their cabins exhausted but alive, ready to begin preparation for the construction season. Victor had a list of 12 families wanting stone-wrapped Quonsets built before next winter. Stefan headed the list. They began work on March 15th, as soon as ground softened enough to dig foundation trenches. Victor laid out the oval foundation, while Stefan gathered stones from creek beds. The construction process went faster, with 2 men working. What had taken Victor 3 weeks alone took 8 days with Stefan helping. They developed an efficient system. Stefan gathered and sorted stones, while Victor placed them. Victor taught Stefan the principles of dry stack masonry, explaining how to select stones that lock together naturally. Anton joined them after they completed Stefan's foundation. 3 men working together raised the stone walls in 12 days. The Quonset assembly took 2 days. By mid-April, Stefan's family moved into their completed shelter. They spent their first night burning a moderate fire and recording temperature readings to compare with their old cabin. Word reached Milos Petrov's surplus yard in Great Falls. Demand for Quonset huts suddenly exceeded supply. Milos wrote to Victor asking what had changed. Victor explained the stonewall technique and its performance through winter. Milos immediately saw the implications. He began advertising Quonsets as components for Novak-style thermal shelters. Sales increased dramatically. By May, 5 shelters were under construction simultaneously. Victor, Stefan, and Anton moved between sites, helping with critical stages while homesteaders handled simpler work themselves. The community developed cooperative construction crews. Men gathered stones together, shared tools, and helped raise walls on each other's properties. Women organized the logistics. They coordinated schedules, delivered meals to work sites, and watched children so men could focus on building. Ilona became unofficial project manager. maintaining lists of who needed help when and what materials were required where. The construction boom created unexpected economic activity. The trading post in Helena sold more cement, hardware, and tools in spring 1951 than in the previous 5 years combined. Wagons hauled Quonset huts from Great Falls weekly. Stone masons from eastern cities heard about the work and traveled west, offering expertise. Janos completed his shelter in June. His family moved in immediately despite summer heat. His wife cried with relief, knowing the next winter wouldn't repeat the suffering of the last. Janos publicly thanked Victor at the trading post, admitting his mockery had been ignorant speaking. By late summer, 19 families had completed stone-wrapped Quonsets. Another dozen were in various construction stages. The technique had spread beyond Victor's immediate community. Homesteaders 50 miles away were adapting his principles. Some modifications appeared: rectangular stone bases instead of ovals, different roof materials, varied sizes, but the core concept remained: thermal mass plus insulation plus weather-shedding roof equals superior winter shelter. Victor spent autumn helping finish shelters before winter returned. He wanted everyone protected before the cold came back. By October, 27 families would face winter in shelters based on his design. That number represented perhaps 100 people who'd sleep warmer, burn less wood, and suffer less because Victor had remembered his grandfather's words about stone remembering temperature. The hybrid design proved superior to conventional log cabins in ways beyond simple temperature retention. As the technique spread through Montana's high country during 1951 and 52, practical advantages became evident across multiple dimensions of frontier survival. Heat retention was the most obvious benefit. Stone-wrapped Quonsets maintained interior temperatures 30 to 50 degrees warmer than exterior conditions with minimal fuel consumption. A family could survive winter on 2 cords of wood where conventional cabins required 8 to 10 cords. The fuel savings alone justified construction costs within 2 years. But the benefits extended beyond heating efficiency. The stone walls created thermal stability that affected daily life in unexpected ways. Food storage improved dramatically. Root vegetables stored inside remained fresh longer because temperature fluctuations were minimal. Bread dough rose predictably. Milk stayed fresh an extra day. These small improvements accumulated into significant quality of life increases. The structures were also more durable than log construction. Log cabins required constant maintenance. Chinking deteriorated and needed replacement. Logs rotted at ground contact points. Corners settled and created gaps. A well-built log cabin lasted 10 to 15 years before requiring major repairs. Stone-wrapped Quonsets required virtually no maintenance. Stone didn't rot, metal didn't settle. The air gap prevented moisture accumulation that caused decay in conventional structures. Families reported that shelters built in 1951 remained structurally sound 5 years later with no significant repairs needed. Construction time favored the hybrid design once builders gained experience. An experienced 2-man crew could complete a stone-wrapped Quonset in 6 weeks. A comparable log cabin required 8 to 10 weeks and more skilled labor. The Quonset assembly itself took only 3 days. Stonework consumed the majority of time, but the techniques were simpler than log joinery. Weather resistance exceeded expectations. The curved metal roofs shed snow loads that crushed conventional roofs. Heavy spring rains that leaked through standard roofing never penetrated the metal shells. Wind couldn't find purchase on the curved surfaces. Structures survived storms that damaged neighboring log cabins. The thermal mass principle that Victor had applied began appearing in other frontier construction. Root cellars incorporated stone walls for temperature stability. Spring houses used stone to maintain cool water temperatures. Even conventional cabins began including stone elements where builders understood the heat storage principles. By 1953, variations of Victor's design had spread to Wyoming and Idaho. Each region adapted the concept to local conditions and available materials. Some used concrete blocks instead of fieldstone. Others incorporated larger windows or different entrance configurations. But the fundamental principle remained: combine thermal mass, dead air insulation, and weather-resistant shells to create shelter that protected inhabitants better than traditional single-material construction. The phrase, "built like a Novak shelter," entered local vocabulary, signifying construction that prioritized function over tradition. Victor's innovation had become a standard, his techniques taught to new homesteaders as proven methods rather than experimental designs. Victor and Ilona raised 4 children in their stone-wrapped shelter over the following 18 years. The structure that neighbors had mocked became the family home where children grew, learned, and eventually left to build their own lives. Through all those years, through countless winters and storms, the shelter performed exactly as Victor had designed it to perform. The interior never fell below 25 degrees, even during the brutal winter of 1957, when exterior temperatures reached -32 degrees for 5 consecutive days. The stone walls continued their patient work, absorbing heat during fires and radiating it back through cold periods, maintaining livable conditions that required neither excessive fuel nor constant tending. Victor never gloated about being proven right. When new homesteaders arrived seeking advice, he shared his knowledge freely and helped with construction when time permitted. He refined his techniques based on years of observation, suggesting improvements to those building new shelters: slightly thicker walls for extreme climates, different stone types for various purposes, modified entrance designs for different site conditions. Janos became Victor's closest friend. The man who'd mocked most loudly became the design's most vocal advocate. Janos helped dozens of families build their own shelters, teaching Victor's techniques with the enthusiasm of a convert. He frequently told the story of his children suffering in inadequate shelter until Victor's innovation saved them. He never let anyone forget that progress often came from those willing to question tradition. Stefan's children grew up in their stone-wrapped shelter. They never experienced the brutal winters their parents remembered. To them, winter was merely a season, not an ordeal to survive. Stefan noted this generational shift with satisfaction. His children wouldn't carry memories of frozen toes and desperate nights because Victor had combined old-world knowledge with new-world materials. Anton's mother lived another 12 years, comfortably surviving winters that would have killed her in conventional housing. She frequently told visitors that Victor Novak's shelter had given her a decade of life she wouldn't have otherwise enjoyed. When she died peacefully in her sleep at age 79, her family attributed her longevity partly to the comfortable winters made possible by Victor's design. The original shelter stood for 63 years. Victor died in 1987 at age 74. Ilona followed 2 years later. Their children sold the homestead, but the new owners kept the shelter, recognizing its historical and practical value. The stone walls remained solid, the metal roof still shed snow efficiently, and the interior still stayed warmer than surrounding structures. Modern historians studying frontier innovation eventually recognized Victor's contribution. His stone-wrapped Quonset represented practical engineering solving real problems with available materials. The technique never became famous beyond regional communities, but it didn't need fame. It needed only to work, and it worked perfectly. Victor's legacy wasn't carved in monuments or written in books. It was built into stone walls scattered across Montana's high country, still standing, still protecting, still proving that one man's obsession with survival could change how entire communities lived through winter's hardest months.